validity, reliability, and accuracy. Okay, let's talk about what they actually mean first of all. By definition, whether or not something is valid depends on whether or not it's doing what it's supposed to do. Okay, so in terms of a scientific experiment, something is valid if the method that you're using fulfills the aim of the experiment. So when you're doing a scientific report, you write your hypothesis, you write your aim, you go into your equipment and then your method, yeah? That aim that you try to achieve, if your method fulfills that aim, then it's valid. If your method doesn't fulfill that aim, then it's not valid. Okay. Let's say, for example, yeah, your aim of your experiment is to measure the enthalpy of combustion for one alcohol. Okay, for one alcohol. Chances are the method that you're using in your school lab is not going to achieve that. The reason for that is because, by definition, enthalpy of combustion, for you to get the correct value, it's the enthalpy of complete combustion, which means whatever alcohol you have, you completely combusted it and you're actually measuring all of the heat that came out of it. That's the only way you get the entire enthalpy. Okay. But when you're doing it in school, yeah, you're probably going to get incomplete combustion, because there's just not enough oxygen that's supplied to actually burn all of your oxygen. How do you know that? It's because when you do this experiment in school, have a watch out for when you finish your experiment, you might end up with slightly more black stuff around your wick. If you end up with more black stuff around your wick, what that is that's the pure carbon that we talked about earlier. If you have incomplete combustion, you get pure carbon, which is soot. Okay, so did you actually measure the enthalpy of combustion? Not really, because the combustion reaction didn't really happen because it didn't actually finish. Okay, so if your experiment is aiming to measure the enthalpy of combustion for one alcohol, you can't really do that in class, because the chances of you being able to model a complete combustion reaction is very slim in a school lab. Can you guys give me a thumbs up if that makes sense? You can't really do it because you don't have enough equipment, enough tech to probably to simulate the combustion reaction properly. Okay, so the chance of you actually doing that and measuring the enthalpy of combustion properly is very slim. However, let's say for example, your intention, your aim isn't to measure the enthalpy of combustion for one alcohol, it's to compare the enthalpy of combustion for methanol, ethanol, propanol, and butanol. Okay, so it's not, your intention isn't to measure it for one reaction. Your intention is to compare enthalpy values between 4 different alcohols. And then you actually did the 4 different alcohols and you got a nice looking trend and you were able to actually compare the numbers. Then in that case, your experiment would be valid. Okay, because in that case, the success of your experiment wasn't dependent on whether you actually simulated the combustion reaction for each of them. It wasn't about the reaction for each of them. It was about whether you can get a number that you can use to compare between the 4. And if you get a number, in which case they show a trend, they have 4 different numbers that you can compare, in that case, you fulfilled your aim, which makes your experiment valid. Can you guys give me a thumbs up if that makes sense as well? Because in that second example, you weren't trying to simulate the combustion reaction in itself. You were trying to get numbers to compare 4 different reactions. So if you were able to do the experiment 4 times, get 4 different numbers that you could compare, then in that case, if that's how you define the aim of your experiment, then your experiment would be valid. Okay, so whether or not your experiment is valid depends on what you're actually trying to do with your experiment. Okay, so think of it this way: whether or not any person is valid, or whether or not what someone says is valid, depends on whether or not they're saying the correct thing. Okay, so if your method is trying to do one thing, but that's not achieving the aim, then it wasn't valid, because by definition, don't think of it in terms of science if that's what you're confused about. In general, something's valid if it makes sense and if it's doing what it's meant to do. Okay, so if the method isn't achieving your aim, then it's not valid, but if it is, then it is valid.